Hey, it's Day, and today I will be discussing the similarities and differences of living in Japan and Korea. I do want to quickly point out that my experiences can be totally different from someone else's. I do live in a city. I do not have any experiences of living in rural Japan nor Korea, so if you are living in those areas, it may be completely different from my experiences as a city dweller, so I just also wanted to point that out. Okay, so let's begin. I'm very fortunate enough to have lived in a multitude of countries, including Japan and Korea. At a young, tender age of 20, I had moved to Japan as an exchange student, which I was very happy about because it was a big dream of mine to live in Japan since I was a kid. So therefore, when I was living in Japan, I was much younger than I am now. Actually, maybe not that much, but I'm currently 26 years old and I do turn 27 in 1 week. So I guess technically I'm 27 years old. I'm also an English teacher here, so I was a student in Japan, but I'm a teacher working here in Korea. Although I do still feel like I'm pretty knowledgeable when it comes to Japan because I do go there quite often, and last year I was probably there for a total of about 2 months. So the first thing I want to talk about is the pricing, especially in Tokyo. It's so much more expensive than it is in Korea or Seoul. From everything, the trains, the buses, the entire system is just so much more pricier. To get from one side of Tokyo to the other, you can be paying easily around 10 to 20 US dollars. Compared to Seoul, you can pay at most maybe 2 US dollars. That's almost 10 times the amount. Even just generally traveling within Japan, it can be very expensive. The Shinkansen can be hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and the Korean version, the KTX, is usually about half the price. Even traveling throughout Korea, even if you take the buses, which are much more affordable, you can be paying 5, 10, 15, 20 US dollars, whereas in Japan, you can be paying 50, 60, 70 US dollars. So just the overall transportation is just so much more expensive. That also includes taxis. So a 5-minute taxi ride in Korea costs about 3 US dollars, whereas a 5-minute taxi ride in Japan can be 10 to 15 US dollars. That does also include clothes. So I'm a huge window shopper. I'm not much of a buyer myself. I do like to witness clothes, but in Korea I do feel more tempted to buy clothes just because it's so much more cheaper here. You can go to Hongdae and find clothes for about $5 to $10, like really cute clothes too. Like I have a really cute skirt, which I'll post a picture, that I bought for 10 US dollars, and it's so cute and the quality is so nice, and it's made in Korea. But in Japan, I mean, clothes are just maybe about 3 times the price. You can find very nice outfits for like 30, 40, 50 US dollars. I oftentimes shopped in thrift stores when I was living in Japan, and even then the prices were about average, so I was still paying about 20 US dollars. And not just clothes, there's also food. I was very pleasantly surprised when I could buy kimbap and dumplings in Korea for about 1 to 3 US dollars, whereas Japan's cheap food averages around 5 to 10 US dollars. And the nicer stuff in Korea, you can pay around maybe $10, whereas in Japan, the nicer stuff can go between like 15 to 20 / maybe even more. And you can also get really nice things in Korea that can also be quite costly too. But just the overall price of food is still much more affordable here in Korea. Therefore, speaking of food, I want to talk about food because it's so fascinating to me. I mean, they're so different, yet there's so many other similarities as well. As a knowledge nerd who loves to learn more about history and culture, I thought this was quite entertaining and exciting. Korean food is all about spices and seasonings. So if you're not a big fan of spicy food, unfortunately, Korea loves spicy food. I love spicy food personally, so I'm very happy and satisfied. Korea does have a lot of non-spicy food, however, so if you don't like spicy food, you'll survive. But it's all about seasonings and salts and a lot of just peppers and chilies. So Korean food is very flavorful in a sense of a lot of spices and a lot of things going on. Gochujang is very common in Korean dishes, which is just red chili paste. You can find it a lot with bibimbap and other variety dishes. Japanese food, on the other hand, is very simple, which is what I do love about Japanese food. I find this very artistically beautiful on how simple it is. In Japan, they really value the simplicity and taking its time when it comes to its food. So even things such as chashu and ramen, the length of taking care of it can be hours and hours and hours. I mean, if you look at sashimi, it's very simple. It's just rice and fish. Of course, there's a little bit of, rice vinegar and stuff. So this is one thing I also really love about Japanese food because it's so delicious and yet so simple. I'm also a huge fan of Korean food, of course. Korean food, I think I actually have a slight more preference over Japanese food just because I am a spice nut, so I do love spices and spicy food. Also, what's really interesting is the fact that there's kind of social aspect when it comes to food between Korea and Japan. So in Korea, socializing amongst food is very, very, very important, which is why you'll see a lot of side dishes. Everything is just meant to be shared. And oftentimes you'll find restaurants where they only allow 2 or more people. You cannot go in if you're solo, just because there's just so much food and it's so expensive, and you're probably not going to finish it all because it's just huge. And then you have the side dishes as well. Not saying that you can't find restaurants for yourself. Of course, there are, mostly you can go to those restaurants, but there are restaurants that only do accept 2 or more people. It's very common to go to the river. For example, in Seoul, we have the Han River or Hangang. It's very, very sociable. It's all about bringing a mat or a tent, and you come with your friends and you just order a bunch of food, and you just sit in there eating and looking at the river and talking amongst each other. So in Korea, food is meant to be social. Even just ordering food on delivery apps, everything is almost meant for 2 or more people. You do have single person options. It's just so much more smaller in comparison to the other options when you do have 2 or more people. So oftentimes I do find myself ordering from the 2 or more list, which is just a general food, and it is a lot of food, so I find myself having 2 meals instead of 1. So there's nothing wrong with that, of course. In Japan, it's quite opposite. If you've been to Japan before and you walked into a ramen shop, you probably have seen that it's usually single seated, and sometimes you can even find shops where there's barcades. I don't know how you want to say it, walls, I guess. So you just sit and there's walls, and it's just you and the server in front of you who's serving the food. In Japan, you can find more solo options. Even in McDonald's in Japan, you'll have those solo single person. I think it's really interesting that in Japan, it's more common to have solo meals versus Korea, where socializing is more important. And of course, if you're in Japan and you're with your friends, it's just very common in Asia in general, where you do share meals. Back in Western countries, or at least in the US, we usually buy our own individual meal and we don't share. But with Japan or Korea or China, you order a bunch of food and then you're all sharing. It's not your own individual dish, it's a collective dish. So even when I was living in the US and I would be with my Japanese friends, I remember once we went to the Cheesecake Factory and we just ordered a bunch of food off the menu and just shared. And it's just very interesting. So even like in the US, I kind of prefer that just because it's nicer, because you can kind of try a different array of foods that you didn't think you could try, I guess, when you're just having your solo dish, right? But now you can try multiple things. I did want to talk about a couple of similarities that I found. So for example, kimbap is like this and then we have maki rolls, which are like this, and they pretty much look the same, right? But they're very different in terms of taste, because maki rolls are kind of, what we think as sushi. So it usually has raw fish in it and, maybe some other things. But again, very simple, especially Japanese maki rolls. In America, maki rolls are quite intense, but also yummy. And then in Korea, we have kimbap. So kimbap is usually like some pickled vegetables and maybe like some ham or some tuna, but they look so similar. So it's kind of interesting, like, how did that happen? But how did they become so different? Another thing I also wanted to talk about was taiyaki, which is here, our Japanese version. And we also have bungonpang here, which is basically the same thing. Pang meaning bread in Korea, so it's like fish bread. So as you can tell, they're basically literally the same things, but I did do some research about it because I was quite curious. And apparently just during the war times when Japan had occupied Korea, just naturally, of course, they brought over Japanese foods, which was taiyaki, and then Korea ended up keeping it even post-war, so that's why they also have their version of taiyaki. Next is the language. One thing that has been so fortunate is the fact that Japanese and Korean grammar is basically the same thing. It's so nice. I mean, minus you just replacing the words itself, but the way the sentence structure is set out, it's the exact same. And it's been super nice because as someone who studied Japanese prior, it made learning Korean so much more smoother, just because it is very difficult to understand if you're not familiar with it, just because in English, the English sentence structure is very different than Korea or Japanese, it's basically kind of flipped a little bit. So for example, we use the verb in like the middle in English, but in Japanese and in Korean to put the verb at the end, and then you have to conjugate it depending on what you're talking about. But that idea is same in both languages, which is very, very nice. But I do want to say that I do think that Japanese is much more easier to pronounce for the English tongue, just because we have those enunciation in English. I don't know if I used the right word or not. Whereas in Korean, there are a lot of things that are kind of unfamiliar in English, like is quite hard to get used to, and especially when you're first studying Korean, and so I do think that Korean is a little bit harder to pronounce, but I don't think it's that much harder. I just think it takes a little bit more time to go over and to learn and to study. That being said, Korean Hangul is so much more easier than Japanese kanji, because kanji is just extremely difficult and there's just so many of them. I mean, learning Hangul is so easy, like so easy, easier than English. You can learn Hangul in easily one day. If you really just took the time to focus and study, you can learn it in one day. Just learning how to read and just learning how to write, it's just easily, like reading one day, writing maybe a week, but yeah, bam, like you're done. Kanji on the other hand, oh my god, even when I was living in Japan, I took a kanji class and it was extremely difficult. Like it was just unnecessarily hard, and especially these days, so many Japanese people do not know all the kanjis. Like they have tough time with kanji, especially when it comes to writing, just because we don't write as much, right? We're kind of usually on our phones nowadays, so we don't write. So many Japanese people cannot write kanji. I remember when we were university students, we thought it was quite entertaining to ask Japanese people, like our friends, like to write the kanji for rose, which I don't know who thought of that, but yeah, but none of them could. They would like go up to the board and they would be like, like they just really couldn't do it. They'll try and they're like, they just really couldn't. Kanji is very hard, and I admire Chinese just because kanji is just Chinese characters, and Chinese language is all kanji. It's like nothing but kanji. So I am so like amazed by China. Like I just really am. That is the differences between the languages, and if you guys are very curious, I could do a future video talking about learning Korean versus learning Japanese. Next is weather. So Korea is very, 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 very cold, unfortunately. Much colder in Japan when it comes to winter, and it makes me very sad because I really hate cold weather. And I come from Ohio in the US, and Ohio also gets cold too. And I was also very, 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 very sad when winter came around in Ohio. So it is now October going on November, and yeah, that means winter is coming. I do think that Japanese summers are a little bit hotter. Both Korea and Japan are pretty extreme when it comes to weather, but I think Korea is more extreme because it has very, very, very hot and humid summers and very, 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 very cold and dry winters. Very, 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 very. Korea's winters are easily, constantly, always in the negatives in Celsius, unfortunately. That's just an average, it's just a negative. It's very cold. When I first came to Korea back in 2012, or technically I guess the second time, for like half a day, so I don't really count it, but I came back in December and I've never experienced like that much of a cold before, and I was coming from Japan, so I wasn't wearing, like, I felt like my winter gear wasn't that much because I was like not that bad, but then I came to Korea and I was literally like suffering, and it's just been getting worse every year. And that was back in 2012, and now it's 2018, so I don't know how I'm gonna survive, but I already like literally bought all my winter stuff, so you know what guys, I'm already prepared because I'm ready to handle this cold, because I am not ready. Actually, I'm ready but not ready. Like I'm ready physically, but mentally I'm not ready. But besides the point, I definitely do prefer Japanese weather over Korean weather. But going back to summers, as I was saying earlier, Japanese summers are a bit hotter than Korean summers are, but it's not that much of a difference. So for example, this past summer, I'm pretty sure Japan hit almost like 44 degrees Celsius, which is really high, plus humidity. But Korea wasn't that much better. It hit like around 41 degrees Celsius plus humidity. So even though Japanese summers are extremely hot, like Korea's summers are still very hot. But Korea's fall and spring is so short, especially fall, which which makes me really sad because I love fall. And I think Japanese falls and springs are just so nice, and the winter isn't that bad. So I do prefer Japanese weather than I do Korean weather, but I'm here, so just gotta tough it out this winter. And that concludes part 1. Here's part 2 here, so go ahead and feel free to click along and learn more right here. Yep, right there, part 2. Part 2.